New Mexico is a land of stories, myths, and legends. The unexplained and the unexplored. I'm Chad Brummett, and we are exploring the unique and unusual world of New Mexico Strange. Hello and welcome to this edition of New Mexico Strange. I'm Chad Brummett. Thank you for joining us. And odds are, if you're watching the show, you've probably heard a few ghost stories before. You've probably heard some legends. You've heard some conspiracy theories. And a lot of times they do have a basis in fact. They have some nugget of truth that's then aggrandized into this larger story. Sometimes they are completely made up. But what is more interesting to me and our guests today, we're going to be talking about this, is not only when it is based in fact, but that the fact can sometimes be scarier than the fiction. We are joined by Matthew Goodwin and Ashley Martinez from the University of New Mexico, Chicano Studies Department. And guys, first of all, thank you for being here with us. I'm very excited about what we're going to be talking about today, which we'll get into in a second. But first, tell us a little bit about yourselves and how you got into this realm.
Sure. So my main research is on Chicana Latina science fiction. I've been doing that for about 15 years. The great thing is that that field has come a long way, and a lot of people are interested in it. We had a conference 2 years ago at UNM called Latinx Visions about science fiction written by Latinos. It's really quite exciting. And actually, one of the first science fiction works was written by a Chicano, was written by Arthur Tenorio, who is a New Mexican. So that's
wow.
yeah, and that book has gone under the radar a bit, and we're hoping to kind of bring it out. So anyway, that has come a long way. So whenever you do a research project, you have to put aside all your other interests.
Right.
Yeah. So what happened is I began to see this connection between conspiracy theories and xenophobia.
Okay.
People who were afraid of immigrants and that connecting to conspiracy theories, which were already correlated with white supremacist groups, going back to Oklahoma bombing. So now I think people see that connection a lot. Conspiracy theories are really a part of daily life, part of political life. It's something that I think everybody needs to know how they work and function, especially in regard to race and ethnicity, which historically they have been very dangerous. One of the big conspiracy theory books, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was a conspiracy about Jews taking over the world, and that was extremely important to Germany in World War II. So conspiracy theories, they can result in real violence. Like again, 15 years ago, I don't think people would recognize that so well, but now I think everybody sees that possibility that if there's some, mysterious dark force, then violence is justified. And so that's one of the things that really kind of got me thinking about this stuff. And then after that, then it's like I began to think about all these other things that in a way academia has thrown out. Mm-hmm. On the whole, I mean, so ghosts and space aliens, and
people sort of write it off and they marginalize it. But there is definitely some cultural relevance to a lot of these narratives.
Yeah. So ultimately, that's what we're looking at, is the cultural relevance of these mysteries, and it's been exciting.
Gotcha. Ashley, how did you get into this realm?
Well, One of Dr. Goodwin's students, Ruben Loza, was telling me all throughout the pandemic that I needed to take a class with you. And it was virtual reality. And I was totally freaked out with that. And I was thinking probably not. But then we all came back, and once again, Ruben was telling me, you need to take a class with Dr. Goodwin. So I did, and now we're here.
Now we're here. Did you have
Yeah.
an interest in paranormal or some of these stories, mystery stories, before?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I love true crime. I love haunting stories, paranormal activity. I love legends and folk tales. And I came back to New Mexico from being at the Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage. So this intangible cultural heritage is so important to me. One day my dream is that one day UNESCO adds intangible cultural heritage to their protections list.
Wow. That is fantastic.
Thanks.
Well, let's dive in first of all. You brought up something, and we got it in the name of our state or our nickname.
Yes.
The Land of Enchantment.
Yeah.
So, in your experience, why does New Mexico seem to be maybe not a mecca, but it does seem to be a hot spot for various mysterious stories, haunted hotels, the Roswell incident, La Llorona, all of these things? What is it about New Mexico that seems to foster this?
Yeah. Well, so, one caveat. I do think that you can do this work anywhere, honestly.
Okay.
I do think every place has some kind of mysterious element that you might have to go look for, or, so the Jersey Devil in, in New Jersey. And
Mothman.
The Mothman.
Point Pleasant,
Point
right?
Pleasant,
Yeah.
So I think you could do this work almost anywhere. New Mexico is interesting, and so one of the things we've been kind of working on is thinking about like why Enchanted, why the Land of Enchantment, and so I'll kind of go through the story a little bit quickly. So, but I'll go way back.
Sure. Okay.
So like from the beginning of Western culture, they looked to the East as the space of the fantastic. So like Alexander the Great would, on his journeys would find hybrid beast, and of course when colonization began of the Americas, they often found wild animals and monsters, and there was this idea that it's the land of the fantastic, as a way to kind of like populate this area that they don't know. So it's about like going into the unknown. And so there was like when Cortez first came, and there was a writer, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who, when they came to Tenochtitlan in Mexico City, they connected it to like a magical, enchanted world. The kinds of worlds that they would see in the literature about knights and like King Arthur and this kind of stuff. So they immediately, at the point of contact, they saw the Tenochtitlan as a magical place. I think everyone could sort of understand that. You go to some new world and like there's these amazing buildings and this amazing society going on, and you kind of like use the fantastic to help you understand what's going on because it's so surprising and new. There's a Cuban author, or Carpentier, who has a phrase, lo real maravilloso.
Okay.
The marvelous real. And it's a similar idea. So, when you encounter the new, it seems marvelous or strange. And so from the beginning of colonization, it had that element. Okay. And they used what they had, which was stories about knights and the Holy Grail and, that kind of magic. Now, when the Spanish came to New Mexico, they also used that same word, encantado, or, encanto, enchanted, to describe primarily the landscape. So there's the enchanted mesa at the Acoma site, Sky City around there, and they were listening to these stories and using what they knew, which is, again, these stories of knights and magic and the Holy Grail, and they put that onto the landscape and to the people. So later, when the next wave of colonization came and the Anglos were coming, there was a writer named Charles Loomis who.
I just Googled him.
Yes, Charles Loomis. That's funny. He is. Yes, Charles Loomis is Google is on Google. And so what he did was interesting because he loved the Pueblo people. So he saw them as really this like beautiful, aesthetic, artistic group. At the same time, he wasn't so keen on the Mexicanos.
Okay.
So he had a very clear division, and the whole point, of course, of Anglos coming to New Mexico at that point was, getting more Anglos so it could be a state.
Okay.
But he also began to use that phrase. So he took that term, enchanted, from this whole history of colonization, mapped it one more time onto New Mexico, and it became the land of enchantment. And then subsequent writers, Lillian White, for example, she has a book called The Land of Enchantment, which came out not very long after Loomis. At that point, then it became a kind of moniker for bringing people to the West, from the East, which was also not just about getting people to work here, but also tourism. As the railroads, began to connect the country, then it became also a tourist element as well. Some people at the time thought that New Mexico was too slow, too backward. So New Mexico remained a territory for a long period of time, primarily because of the racism element, and that's been documented historically, At the same time, there were artists who liked the idea, like Loomis, and writers who came out to get away from modern life, which is also somewhat problematic, because they're like not seeing the people as they are. They're kind of creating a fantasy, an enchanted fantasy. So all that is to say that it's complicated, because I think most people think of Land of Enchantment as generally a positive term, and like as a badge of honor, really, and I think it is. I think it's taken on that meaning, and it should. But it's also important to know that history, and that some of those patterns continue. People coming as tourists and not really understanding the depth of the cultures and history. So that is more or less where that's at. And there's been a lot of talk back, the land of entrapment, so like thinking about that, maybe it's not so rosy as people say. There's of course problems. And one of my colleagues, Michael Trujillo, has a book on the land of disenchantment, looking at, drug use and the problems that way of like utopian thinking can kind of like hide that part. Just one more little bit. The thing that to me is really interesting, because I worked in Puerto Rico for a while, teaching at the university, is Puerto Rico also is called the Island of Enchantment.
Really?
La Isla del Encanto.
Okay.
And I think it very, very similar reasons. Honestly, that should be a whole book, connecting Puerto Rico and New Mexico.
Yeah.
Because there's a very similar history of a space that is more Spanish, that kind of like had trouble coming into the Union. And of course, Puerto Rico is still a colony of the U.S., the kind of one colony that's not a state. So, and there are strange connections like that. It really became popular, that La Isla del Encanto became popular when Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the third, went to Puerto Rico and was governor for in the 30s, I believe. And he talked about it as the Island of Enchantment. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt has a connection to New Mexico as well, with coming here and getting the people for the Rough Riders. There's a kind of pattern of calling these spaces magical and strange. The truth is, it's complicated.
Sure.
And definitely in Puerto Rico, La Isla del Encanto is absolutely positive. It's totally like a badge of honor.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just think people should know the history, you know, and where it comes from, and then we can change the meaning and
Yeah.
use it however we want.
Or at least understanding too, like you said, that, because I think it's really easy sometimes for folks to, you think of something exotic,
Yes.
especially if you think about,
Yeah.
in other studies of Indigenous and First Nations people, that oftentimes when when colonial settlers would come over, they would view them as this sort of exotic
Yes.
thing, and as more and more came, that kind of shifted, but that it's not as easy and as easy as just, oh, it's enchanted, it's lovely. There's complication to it.
Yes, and enchanted is very tied to being exotic. I absolutely think
Yeah.
that's right. I think that's a really good point. And one more tiny bit, I do think that it's kind of a sub note, but I think the desert, at least in the American imagination, is the space of spirituality and magic and enchantment and finding yourself.
Yeah.
So I think there's also that as well. It's New Mexico is enchanted in part because of some of the desert environments that are here as well.
Yeah. A lot of people, they will come here to Taos, to Santa Fe,
Yes.
to the northern parts of
Yeah.
the state for, spirituality
Yes.
and various reasons for that. Looking at some of the stories that you have studied, and we were kind of talking about it before we started rolling here today, were some common themes that you might find within a lot of these stories. Are there common themes? Are there common occurrences or instances that we find when we're talking about Chicano studies that are based in historical fact or historical incidents?
You want to go, Ashley?
There's a lot. Okay, so the first thing that comes to my mind is a theme or a dichotomy between deceit and revenge. I think at the basis of almost every mystery is some type of deceit and some type of revenge. Mm-hmm. We see this very clearly with La Llorona.
Yeah.
We have all heard it growing up, and it's our waterway specific, whether it's the Pecos River or the Rio Grande or the big, huge drainage canals in Albuquerque. Mm-hmm. It has to do with place. And it's all relative, right? Who is it scary for? I think is maybe a good question to ask ourselves.
Okay.
We also have to realize that there's more and more layers that we have to dig into. Mm-hmm. So on the surface, La Llorona is scary for children, little kids. It's to teach us to stay away from these dangerous rivers and waterways. It's to kind of scare the children into taking care of themselves.
Right.
Right. And
make sure you're home before dark. Don't play near the river.
Exactly. And nothing good happens after midnight
Right.
is what just, goes into my head. And my grandpa said it so much, Mm-hmm. But I am really interested in taking La Llorona one step further.
Okay.
As kind of a warning to young people, to young women and young men, to be careful who they choose as their partner. To me, that is one of the biggest takeaways from this story.
Yeah.
And I mean, we see firsthand in this legend how this woman suffers and lives at the edges of society, and ultimately she does something very horrific, very tragic. And I think that we are surrounded by La Llorona more frequently than we would like to imagine. In Dr. Goodwin's class, I was able to write a little bit about the connection between La Llorona and true crime, where mothers who maybe weren't horrible people ended up doing a horrible thing.
Yeah.
Murdering their children.
Right.
Right?
And one that directly comes to mind, not here in New Mexico, but Susan Smith. The case of Susan Smith years ago that drowned her children. It was a whole thing about it that they had been, kidnapped, but it very much kind of plays into that. And we've previously spoken with local author Benjamin Radford
Yes.
about the idea that it seems that there is a La Llorona in a lot of different cultures, even going
Yeah.
back to the Greeks with
Sure.
Medea.
Yeah.
That because when we're talking about what scares, as a kid, it definitely scared me from all those things. Don't play
Yeah.
near the rivers.
Yeah.
But as an adult and as a parent, it terrifies me on a completely other level.
Yeah.
A completely different level than it did when I was a child.
Yeah.
And that it does serve some sort of allegorical purpose of staying in the right way. And it's
Yeah.
interesting that you bring that up of that fear of, do you really know this person? Which is, I think, a very contemporary fear,
Yeah.
and one that a lot of people have, especially in a social media age,
Yeah.
Yes.
when you don't know if that person on that profile is actually that person on that
Right.
profile.
Absolutely.
Well, and so La Llorona is interesting because, I mean, it definitely is a Mexican tale, and that's why it's so important to New Mexico, and it does connect the North and the South, these stories, it really is a statewide thing. But also, La Llorona has been kind of reinterpreted and rethought by Chicana scholars for decades. And so just to sort of like give you an example of that and connect it to, recently I went on a ghost tour in New Orleans,
Oh, okay.
which was very interesting.
I was gonna say, you want to talk about ghosts
Yeah.
in New Orleans?
Yeah, they have
You could
ghosts,
do a lot worse than New Orleans.
they got ghost. So there's one about a Madame La Laurie, and
Okay.
she was owned this house, and she was really cruel to slaves and tortured them, and one of the there's an African American scholar, Tia Miles, who looked at that tour, and she was seeing how the narrative of La Laurie kind of eclipsed the real horror, which was slavery itself. So so there's also something about thinking through what these stories do and who is not in the story in a way. And slavery itself was a torture. Like you don't need an individual story, but it certainly makes it graphic and tangible. So there's ways of like being critical of these stories as well. So, like La Llorona. I mean, just think about just domestic violence and like violence in families and how widespread that is. It's alarming how widespread it is. And if there were, so that's the actual violence in families is domestic violence, primarily men against women. And so that is just left out of the story. We get the story of the evil woman who kills her children, and so she becomes the ultimate evil other.
Right.
But
No one really talks about the husband and maybe some of the
gets
things
off.
that had happened. And
he gets off free, yeah.
And do you think that some of that also kind of plays into old stereotypes of that it's the failure of the female as
Yes,
opposed to
absolutely.
the malfeasance of the male figure?
Yes.
That he's not the villain.
Exactly.
Llorona is the villain.
Exactly.
Villain.
And so there's this tension because the stories keep going, and we use them for a different purpose to scare children and also to make us think about who we have as a partner.
Right.
So it keeps going, but there's this kind of like cultural ideas nested within the story that focuses our attention in a particular way and away from the things in a way that we need to care about, which is actual violence in families. Those instances of mothers killing their children, of course, happen, but they're extremely rare.
Right.
So I don't know. That's what happens with folktales.
Yeah. Now, you brought up one, too, that we had talked about in another story that really, I think, in many ways put New Mexico on the map globally, which is the Roswell incident.
Yeah.
And the idea of aliens, literal, I mean, you can't get much more foreign than coming from another planet.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about the Roswell incident and that legend and how it kind of plays into some of these ideas of that fear of the outsider and some things that you were kind of talking about and getting the view from 35,000 feet, this idea of reversing or possibly erasing colonization. How does all of that tie into together?
Yeah, so I guess I should say one thing to preface it is that, so I'm teaching a class on mysteries of New Mexico and beyond. The beyond is really important. We are looking everywhere possible. But for us, mysteries are not just a question. They are. They sort of have this question, or this problem or something that is unanswered, and it keeps being unanswered.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, yeah.
If we knew the answer, it was solved, it wouldn't be a mystery anymore.
We wouldn't be talking about it. So a lot of these things, like Roswell, and are there ghosts, and what is the chupacabra? What are these monsters? A lot of them have a kind of deep cultural meaning, and that is what we're interested in looking at, and kind of shifting around and seeing what they mean historically, what they mean to us now, in some ways more importantly. So Roswell is one of those that I think is really clear to people that it is more than a question. It's not just, did an UFO crash or not? And I guess the first step is, it's more than a question because there's a bigger question, which is, are there space aliens? Mm-hmm. And this is a big scientific question. It's a big question that we all have in general. Of course, it would change everything if it's true.
Right.
It will change. So it's a huge question. A lot of them small mysteries contain these big mysteries.
Right.
The ghost, or is there a supernatural?
Mm-hmm.
What is
there
God
life
doing
after death? And Mm-hmm.
So there's the big mysteries, but there's also the media response to these things. Very often, like the chupacabra, for example, the media was enormous. The chupacabra was born in the age of the internet, in 1995. So it was very much involved in that. Roswell came before that, so it has a little bit of a different story to it. But there's a couple of things. One is that the geography is important. That part of the country, and really New Mexico in general, has kind of different waves of colonization coming in, and different groups coming in. And so there's the Mexicano community in Roswell, which generally is not part of this story. They're sort of left out of the story.
Yeah.
There is very close to Roswell is the Bosque Redondo Memorial Museum, which was kind of this is the place where the U.S. took the Navajo and into these concentration camps. And so that is sort of part of the background of this story as well. Because throughout European literature, early science fiction, the space alien was almost always correlated with indigenous people.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
At certain moments, it was the Chinese, but as a way to kind of show how extremely different they were, and other, quote unquote. But almost always it was about indigenous people, and comes out very clear in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which is kind of the origin, story of space aliens that Americans use when we tell alien
Which again,
stories.
in that incident, predated Roswell for people, for their timeline.
Yeah.
The War of the Worlds came before the Roswell incident.
Yes, this is early 20th century. Mm-hmm. The idea of that story is that the colonization is reversed. So instead of Britain going to India to colonize, it is the aliens from Mars colonizing London and then and Britain. So now there's a sense in which that is useful to sort of get another perspective, to know what it feels like to be colonized, for example. But at the same time, it sort of erases the actual, colonial history for this fantasy. So that pattern gets replayed over and over throughout the history of science fiction in the U.S., in literature and film, and in Roswell as well. Roswell is about this sort of, this cowboy. Max Brazel is this, this cowboy who finds the material, and then the army comes in and puts him in a house where he can't communicate with the outside world. And so they immediately have this kind of weird media kind of moment where the army says they found a UFO, and then they very quickly said that they didn't,
Right.
that it was all
It was
like
a weather balloon.
A weather balloon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So then the conspiracy theory part comes in with that. The story of Roswell becomes a kind of like live action playing out of our story of space aliens, which is about colonization. It's the fear of colonization. So this bring it back to conspiracy theories, which of course Roswell is the big conspiracy theory, and so that's why we have this kind of it's often a joke. There's T-shirts about it. Undocumented aliens or illegal aliens from outer space,
right?
This kind of thing. But that is how people talked about immigrants especially like in the 90s in particular. As they were invading, that immigrants were invading. That would show up in a lot of films like Men in Black and that kind of thing.
Right.
Over time, that message of immigrants invading kind of fell away a little bit because in a way it's a fantasy, especially when you connect it to space aliens. But then we have this other one come in, the conspiracy theories about immigration. In a way, are more dangerous because conspiracy theories are, again, kind of live action stories. They, with Pizzagate, for example, they get people out there and with guns to
it galvanizes someone to action that could have real world consequences.
Yeah.
And just really quick, going back to critical mystery studies, and what it is and what the tools are that we use in analyzing things like the crash landing in Roswell. We look at mystery, to analyze mystery, first of all, something that we're doing right here, right now in real time. Looking at the historical, then the textual, maybe the newspaper. Going back to see the connectivity to critical race studies. And one thing that we are very fond of is entanglement theory. With this, aliens are connected to race and colonialism, demonization of immigrants, and the alien as a foreigner. Aliens ultimately are strange and they have a wider perspective than we do. And there's also this really, really icky clinical sense to aliens. And last but surely not least is the praxis of resonance, which could be similar to entanglement, but it's like finding ways to talk about connectivity and understanding and finding ways to emotionally resonate with these stories, or how we don't resonate with these stories. It's very much an analysis of the insider-outsider dichotomy.
Yeah, and that plays out in not just stories that we tell each other, ghost stories, campfires. I mean, you look at so many of the Hollywood cinema, especially if you're looking at the thriller, the horror genre. So many times it is that fear of this threat from the outside versus a threat that's coming from within ourselves.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing is these figures, monsters, space aliens in particular, can take in any group, and and that's kind of what I was saying is they have taken in all these different groups, indigenous people, and then immigrants, because they are outside of history, they are fantastical beings. Of course, they have a basis in science to a degree, especially aliens. They are theoretically possible, and theoretically have come, but we just don't know. But other mysteries as well, because they have this kind of like abstractness to them. If you look in the story, like with La Llorona, if you look in there, you're always going to find it entangled with some kind of social oppression or some kind of cultural issue. And I think that there has been work done some on ghost in academia in terms of as a metaphor.
Okay.
But one of the things that I think that makes our work challenging is that we come into these things not thinking about them just as metaphors.
Right.
We don't, in a way, want to disturb the mysteries. We want to kind of like engage them, and we're not trying to figure everything out about Roswell at the end of the day. I mean, it makes it challenging because we have to sit with the mystery. We have to be a little bit uncomfortable with not knowing.
Yeah.
Which mysteries are great because they engage your curiosity. They're fun. They can be, they're amazing stories.
Well, and it seems too that some of these mysteries, as you said, we're not necessarily looking for the answer. We're not looking to solve it. We're not Scooby-Doo here.
Yes.
But we do want it to get us to think a little bit, that at least it inspires some sort of critical thinking about what sort of underlying themes are there.
Yeah.
To that end, because I know we're running out of time here, the last question that I have for you guys, and this really is just sort of your opinion, do you think that we are learning anything from these lessons? Has Llorona taught us something? Has the Roswell incident taught us something about ourselves when it does come to this idea of squaring up our history of colonization, especially here in New Mexico? I mean, there are so many stories throughout history of atrocities that have happened here. Are we learning anything, or are we just kind of doomed to repeat these narratives? We just change out the actors and change out the place and change out the time of when they're happening.
Can I say one
please.
thing? Sorry, no,
You're both jumping at the bit for that.
No,
just
I'm
like-
sorry. I'm actually going to go back to Scooby-Doo. Sorry.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of Scooby-Doo is interesting because it actually is so many of the shows, at least the ones that I watched from 1,000 years ago, were about land.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember, but I mean, so many of these were about like, houses, who owns a house, and someone becoming a monster to like scare away the people from the land so they can build a new fun house or whatever, or a new carnival.
Yeah.
So I think that's definitely one of the things that we are seeing is really important in terms of New Mexico, is mysteries are always somewhere. They're always someplace. And there's always a kind of connection to the land, and that doesn't mean that we have the answer about that. But I do think that that is in a way the starting point. Is like knowing where you are, where you're at, what is haunting the land, what has been there before,
and what the underlying motive is for it too, because there's always that, when you're looking at Scooby-Doo. But again, it's a somewhat of a reflection of who we are. Yeah. And you can kind of see that. You were super chomping at the bit, my friend.
Sorry. I mean, you're asking really great questions. One thing that we can share with our family and our friends, especially those who have little kids, tell them these mysteries and legends and stories, and let your children befriend them. That's the biggest gesture of respect. And with time and over the course of people's lifetimes, it's really up to them to dig as far as they want into these mysteries. There are so many layers. What La Llorona meant to me as a 5-year-old is definitely not the same thing as a 20, 30, or 40-year-old. And it's really up to us to keep thinking about it, keep considering, looking for the truth, referencing history, talking to those around us.
In a way, it is part of like the goal of the university to understand and make progress.
Sure.
And I think that it absolutely, at least the work that we're beginning, from what I'm seeing, is definitely we're making progress in terms of understanding these mysteries better and their cultural context.
I know we got to wrap up on time, and like I said, there are so many different directions that we can go. If we want to learn more about your work and your published work, where can we find you?
So I'm a professor at UNM, so you can just go to my UNM page in the Chicana Studies Department.
Okay.
Matthew David Goodwin. And I teach Chicanx, Latinx science fiction, mysteries of New Mexico and beyond. and we're working on a class on art and aesthetics, Latinx art and aesthetics as well. So that's probably the best place.
Okay.
And then you'll find a couple of different websites related to that: Critical Mystery Studies, the Latinx Archive, which has all our anthologies about Latinx science fiction.
Okay. And that's accessible to just anyone?
Yes.
Any general audience?
Yes.
Okay, that's good to know. Well, guys, thank you so much. This is a
thank
really
you.
fascinating, and, honestly, I feel like we're just kind of scratching the surface on this topic, and that there is so much more to discuss, but also so much more to learn. It
Yes.
sounds like. So hitting up UNM's website, learning a little bit more about this if audiences are interested in this, because it sounds like an incredibly interesting topic, and sometimes maybe a difficult topic. Sometimes these conversations not so easy to have. But if you turn, into a monster from Mars, or, a weeping woman on the banks of the Rio Grande, it may be a little easier to digest, to find that
Absolutely.
that real world lesson that lies at its bedrock.
That's true. Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah.
So, but you do have to dig a little bit. Yeah,
do have
into
to
the
dig.
mystery,
You gotta get a little-
because you can stay on the level of the story and enjoy it, and that's totally
Sure.
fine. That's perfect. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
But it seems that, they're going to continue to grow, and they continue to live in these different iterations, because they are important stories, and there are things that we can get from it. Guys, thank you again so much for coming in.
you.
And again, thank you for joining us on this episode of New Mexico Strange. If you want more information on this story, all the other stories that we have talked about, we will have information at krqe.com. Until next time, I'm Chad Brummett. This has been New Mexico Strange.